our first speaker is Eric Hatala Matthes. He's associate professor at Wellesley College, and he's done a lot of really interesting work on the ethics of cultural conservation and preservation, and also on the ethics of cultural appropriation. And so we're really excited to hear what he has to say to us today. The title of his paper is "What Can Conservation Conserve?"
Thanks. Thanks very much for having me. So yes, thank you so much to Anne and to Ivan for the invitation. I'm really honored to be here among this fantastic group of scholars, many of whose work I've written about and taught and admired for many years. So exciting for me. I'm looking forward to hearing what everybody has to say at the event today. Is this the? Okay. Awesome. Thank you. So I've been thinking about aspects of philosophical issues in preservation and conservation for most of my academic career so far. And in that time, I found it useful to think about conservation as a sort of a five-place predicate, roughly. S conserves X for the sake of V by Ying on behalf of Z. And this is exactly the point at the very beginning of our symposium where people say, why did we let philosophers into the room? Much more legibly, forget the variables, right? I find that useful, but we're talking about these five different variables at stake in conservation. There's someone who conserves an object, right, for the sake of some value by acting in a particular way on behalf of some set of people. And this cues, I think, five different questions, right, that we might ask about conservation. And those can be framed either descriptively or normatively. And so here I sort of frame them normatively, right? Who ought to be conserving a thing? What ought to be conserved? What ought to be the point of conserving a thing? How ought this goal be achieved? For whom ought this thing be conserved? And we might, add or subtract from this list, but I think that this sort of frames a set of crucial questions about conservation. And considering the conservation of active matter draws our attention most directly, I think, to how we answer questions 2 through 4, though I will suggest ultimately that it also has some implications for 1 and 5, briefly at the end. But for now, I'm going to sort of zero in on these ones. So what I want to argue is that is the case with respect to active matter specifically, because of the distinctive varieties of aesthetic value it affords, but furthermore, that considering the case of active matter has implications for how we think about the conservation of things that we might not initially gloss as active. And this is because the conservation of active matter unsettles certain assumptions about the target of conservation, question 2, by reorienting our thinking toward the conservation of processes and relations rather than just physical things, and that this shift in target carries with it associated modifications to the methods of conservation that are appropriate, right? Question 4, and the point of pursuing them, question 3. So I was charged by our conveners with the task of speaking on the pleasures of fungi and bacteria, and that is not an area that I have heretofore worked on. I was told I could interpret this charge liberally, but I wanted to take it seriously. And conveniently, I'm married to an ecologist who was able to give me a quick primer on fungi, and I can't tell you how delighted she was. So I want to draw your attention to 2 aspects of fungi in particular. I haven't really embraced bacteria as much, that invite reflection on, I think, 2 kinds of aesthetic value. So the thing that a fungus grows on is called a substrate, and this term can be used in 2 different senses. So first, substrate can refer solely to the material surface on which the fungus grows, and second, substrate can also refer to the food source for the fungus. So the substrate will often be both the food source and the thing on which the fungus grows, but the 2 can come apart. Right? Now, both of these senses of substrate refer to a kind of dependence relation. In the first sense of substrate as the surface, the dependent relationship of fungus to substrate is host to a range of aesthetic experiences. So visually, it often yields an engaging juxtaposition of colors and textures. Right? Moreover, the delight of that visual aesthetic can be highlighted by, I think, the very non-intentional nature of it. So when you think about lichen growing on a rock, right, where a brilliant and soft green stands out against a rough, right, gray and red backdrop, part of the appeal of nature aesthetics here is the very uncrafted nature of these aesthetic features, juxtapositions that we might also prize in the context of a Baroque painting, right, but where they're constructed in an intentional way. Right? But I think even more interesting than this first, dependence of fungus to substrate is, I think, when we turn our attention to the second sense of substrate, that which is consumed by the fungus. So this kind of dependence is furthermore, it's transformative, it's generative of new kinds of life. We might think of the aesthetic dimensions both in terms of the results of the process, like a mushroom, for example, but also the process itself. Something often highlighted and aestheticized in nature documentaries, and we'll look at an example of that soon, where the film is sped up so that we can better experience that aesthetic as rendered visually in a digestible time frame. So even when we can't observe the processes happening, though, there can still be aesthetic dimensions to marvel at. So my 4-year-old son, for instance, delights in witnessing mushroom blooms that follow rainstorms. And I think he's really onto something there. There's the seeming emergence of something from nothing is an appropriate object of marvel and wonder. So the forms themselves are visually engaging, but all the more so for having sprung up in unexpected places, seemingly out of the blue. And photo credit to my wife's doctoral student, Ashley Lang. I stole these from her Twitter feed. They're beautiful. So, of course, such new life doesn't always spring seemingly out of the blue, but sometimes explicitly from a particular source and explicitly from a kind of death, right? So, to quote from Yuriko Saito's wonderful paper on the aesthetic experience of unscenic nature, she writes, "We see and feel the drama of the life cycle in the motionless elk carcass, in contrast to its dignified movement we have witnessed or can imagine, exuding the texture and smell of decay, along with the incessant movements of maggots, as if to symbolize the unglamorous yet crucial work crew behind the scene." So, death here is producing something, an orchestration of sensory outputs that we can come to appreciate if, as Yuriko notes, we can attend to how nature tells its own story. Now, even the disturbing and frankly horrific work of fungus can have aesthetic dimensions like this, and specifically be aestheticized, as in this breathtaking clip that I'm going to show you from the original Planet Earth documentary. And fair warning, this is a disturbing 3 minutes.
Incredibly, 80% of all insects live in jungles. Few are more successful than the ants. There can be 8 million individuals in a single hectare. But jungle ants don't have it all their own way. These bullet ants are showing some worrying symptoms. Spores from a parasitic fungus called cordyceps have infiltrated their bodies and their minds. Its infected brain directs this ant upwards. Then, utterly disorientated, it grips a stem with its mandibles. Those afflicted that are discovered by the workers are quickly taken away and dumped far away from the colony. It seems extreme, but this is the reason why. Like something out of science fiction, the fruiting body of the cordyceps erupts from the ant's head. It can take 3 weeks to grow, and when finished, the deadly spores will burst from its tip. Then any ant in the vicinity will be in serious risk of death. The fungus is so virulent it can wipe out whole colonies of ants. And it's not just ants that fall victim to this killer. There are literally thousands of different types of cordyceps fungi, and remarkably, each specializes on just one species. But these attacks do have a positive effect on the jungle's diversity, since parasites like these stop any one group of animal getting the upper hand. The more numerous a species becomes, the more likely it will be attacked by its nemesis, a cordyceps fungus.
So, right. So what I want to highlight there, right? So if you haven't seen that before, yeah, it's something else, right? So yeah, let's hope that we don't get human cordyceps targets. So what's happening here? I mean, on the one hand, there's something very disturbing and horrific being presented. But one thing I want to highlight is how, in particular, in the sort of the tracking shot at the end, right? The result of this is really aestheticized, right, in the film, right? And it's beautiful. There's something very beautiful about the resultant forms, right? But we can note the beauty of those forms, right, the colors and the geometry. But I think the distinctive aesthetic pleasures of it being a fungus in this case come not primarily from the product, but the processes through which it works, and in particular the life-granting qualities of that process that begins with death and decay. If you're presented with these forms without having seen the story leading up to it, I think that the way in which we would think about the aesthetic of the resultant form would be quite different. Right? So these non-exhibited properties, as we say in philosophy, knowledge of which shapes the aesthetic of these visual properties that they result in is sort of crucial to understanding what's to appreciate or value in the resultant form. So what I want to emphasize then is that these aesthetic dimensions of fungus, found in its dependent and generative relation to substrate, do not only have a visual dimension, but are specifically contingent on the active relationship of fungus to substrate, providing a window on the relationships of dependence and generation in nature. Because of this, conserving that aesthetic value will require, in some form, conserving that relationship itself. So conservation focused on the material itself, or the look of the material, would be inadequate to capturing the special kind of aesthetic experience that active matter, such as fungus, affords. So to highlight this point, I want to compare to the work of... I can't track forward. You can just go to the next slide. Thanks. Compare this to the work of artist Kathleen Ryan. So this is her Bad Lemon. This rendering of moldy fruit is interesting for the way it challenges our thinking about product versus process as well. Right? So it captures the look of moldy fruit, and it plays with the idea of its value by aestheticizing that look further through the choice of medium. Right? The fungus is constructed of semi-precious stones. And I'll show you a couple others of her pieces. I haven't seen these in person, but the pictures are marvelous. Particularly like this one, Soft Spot. So the work cues the association of processes of decay, but the product is not itself a direct function of or an effort to preserve those processes. Right? So the work reminds us of active matter, and its proper interpretation depends on our familiarity with active matter. But this is not an active work. Right? So by contrast, this work can help us see, I think, what would be lost in an approach to the conservation of active matter that did not attend to the conservation of process or the relationship between process and product. It makes sense here precisely because it's not an active work. But if we sort of had the crystallization of an active process like this, right, we'd be missing something about any effort to conserve the underlying relationship and process through which an actual fungus would be produced in the context of an active work. So let's return for a moment to some of the questions we set out from. Right? What ought to be conserved? What ought to be the point of conserving a thing? How ought this goal be achieved? When it comes to the aesthetics of active matter, we find reason to prioritize process over product as the target of conservation. This is because of the distinctive aesthetic value of these processes as differentiated from the products alone, which in turn will favor methods that allow for the continuation and renewal of such processes. So when it comes to artworks that utilize fungus, right, the relevant form of conservation may favor opportunities for further growth and regrowth rather than prioritizing a particular manifestation of the physical object, especially when the work is drawing attention to process. So this is a work by the artist Aniela Hoytink, who is here. She's growing dresses from fungal materials, from mushroom roots. So for those who were at our session yesterday, we were talking about demos. On her website, she presents this as a proof of concept, and so that's interesting to sort of compare there. If you take a work like this, which is supposed to be a response to the wasteful trends of fast fashion, her website touts, and I quote, "After wearing, you can simply bury your garment in the ground and it will decompose," right? So to try to conserve the material object itself in a case like this, I think would be just completely antithetical to the artistic aim. So when it comes to questions about conservation, we should be interested in these kinds of cases, in the preservation of these processes and allowing for opportunities for that to sort of happen and rehappen. And there's also a handbag. So I think, once we see the ways in which active matter, like fungi and artworks that employ them, can shape the targets, goals, and approaches to conservation, there's the promise that this new perspective may shape the way in which we think about the conservation of other things as well. So the conservation of active matter unsettles these assumptions, as I've been saying, about the target of conservation by reorienting our thinking towards the conservation of process and relation. And this may be relevant even in cases where those processes and relations are not as explicitly central to the aesthetic value of a thing as they are in the case of fungi. So processes of age and decay are found, as Ivan and Anne noted, in all sorts of material objects. And when we, for instance, face environmental conditions that are inhospitable to the preservation of material objects, we may find value in taking a leaf out of the fungus book, to mix metaphors, and thinking about what aesthetic promise might be found in allowing such processes to continue. Right? However, I want to conclude by raising a concern about these broader implications for conservation. So while the conservation of active matter reminds us that destructive processes like decay can also be generative of new value, I think we need to be wary of how this broadened perspective might lead us to an extreme view that prioritizes the generative power of destruction beyond all else. So I think we see this kind of view appearing as a central theme in the work of the archaeologist and heritage scholar Cornelius Holtorf, who argues throughout his work that we ought to abandon our concern with preserving everything. And precisely because, he says, destruction is generative of new value. Right? He ultimately thinks of preservation as a kind of fetish because whether a thing is preserved or destroyed, value is created either way. Right? But I worry that this approach recalls Robert Eliot's famous restoration thesis, the concern that if we adopt certain assumptions about the replaceability of nature and natural processes, we will license the destruction of nature based on the promise that we can simply restore it afterwards. So analogously, in Holtorf's case, we get this notion that we should not concern ourselves with preservation because destruction will lead to new value, right? Hey, so why bother? There's always going to be this new value produced. So while I think that there are important lessons that the conservation of active matter has to teach us about the value of process, we should be wary of taking those lessons too far in our general conservation practices. I mean, to attend to the question that Ivan and Anne were talking about, sort of when is the allowance of a process important and when is preservation important, not to just sort of assume that because destruction always produces some kind of value that we should therefore take destruction as our operating approach when thinking about conservation issues. So to counter this tendency, we need to attend to the reasons why something is being destroyed and the specific relationship of that destruction to what it produces. So I'm reminded here of the work by philosopher Chike Jeffers, who makes a related point in his discussion of Kwame Anthony Appiah's work on cultural preservation. So Appian notes that traditions and customs are preserved through change. They cannot be frozen in time if they are to survive. And Jeffers grants this point, but notes that this does not entail that all changes to tradition are therefore the same or equally conducive to the preservation of them as traditions, to the elements of them that are regarded as valuable. Right? So changes to traditions that stem from colonial interference, for instance, are not necessarily equivalent to just any change. And this is what very briefly brings us back to the other two questions about conservation that I put to the side until now. Right? Who ought to be conserving a thing, and for whom ought this thing be preserved or conserved? Extrapolating lessons from the conservation of active matter concerning the value of processes can also direct our attention outward to who is doing the conserving and for whom conservation takes place. For instance, if we consider the infamous case of the Zuni war gods, what is viewed by one community as neglectful decay may be viewed by another as an essential process that is a central value, the central value of the thing consists in. And so when we consider examples of matter that is viewed as active by some, but not all, we'll need to attend carefully to how participation in the practices and aims of conservation is negotiating and prioritizing, conservation of material objects versus the allowance of processes, including decay. So I'll conclude with that, and thank you very much.